So we're talking specifically about the hip and exercises we can do to help strengthen our hip, again, to both prevent and treat irritation with our hip. Hip exercises are a little bit of a thing for me because and anyone that knows me well enough knows, I golf a lot and it's caused me multiple problems over the years. And I've developed an issue called femoral acetabular impingement, which made golfing very difficult. A lot of people thought, oh, hey, I guess you got to do a lot more stretching for your hip. It actually ended up being the opposite. What I actually had to do was create a lot more stability in my hip. So when we think of the shoulder, and people hear about rotator cuff injuries to the shoulder, we know that there's a cuff of muscles that wraps around the head of our humerus that helps to stabilize our shoulder. Well, my hip is a ball and socket joint too, and there are a small group of muscles that wrap around the head of our femur that help to control the position of our hip. It's the same kind of ball and socket joint with maybe a little less range of motion than our shoulder. So we're going to go over a couple of exercises to help identify those kind of small muscles and strengthen those smaller muscles that might be responsible for the stability of our hip. So what we're going to do, very simple, we've taken an elastic band and put it around my knees. I'm going to come down onto my side and we're going to work at the external rotation of my hip. So very simply, I'm just going to try to keep my abdominals braced and keep my pelvis still as I raise that top leg up. And I basically want to feel like I'm squeezing the muscles in my butt as I then lower the leg down under control. We're going to think the way up and the way down are equally important. So I'm not just lifting up and then letting the band pull me back down. I'm going to control the way up, feel that squeeze in my glute, and then I'm going to control the way down, trying to minimize the shake or the segmentation of the movement. I want to try to smooth that out and create better control of the range of motion of my hip. I would obviously flip over and do that on both sides. From there, with the same band, if I just want to be efficient, I can turn onto my back. So we just worked on hip rotation. I'm now going to try to stretch the band in this position so I feel those muscles in my hips are working. And from here, I'm going to squeeze the muscles of my glutes as I lift my hips up off the floor. Again, now I'm working on hip extension. I'm still keeping my abdominals tight and my spine neutral. So I'm not arching my back to make this happen. I'm purely extending from my hips. And I can make the exercise more challenging by doing it on a single leg. Now I feel that my right glute is working hard as my obliques keep my pelvis from rotating. And again, just doing 5, 10, 15, 20 repetitions of this, you'll feel, a lot of you will feel these muscles maybe for the first time as we get those glutes firing. So I can get rid of the band, and now I'm going to turn on to my hands and knees. So once I've established strengthen the muscles of my hips, now I want to work on controlled movement. So if I come down on all fours, a lot of people will call this kind of a modified like fire hydrant exercise because it kind of looks like a dog near a fire hydrant. But I'm going to start working on hip flexion, external rotation, internal rotation and extension, and then back to neutral. I'm going to go nice and slow, taking my hip through a slow, controlled, full range of motion. Again, I'm still keeping my core braced, so I'm not creating a lot of extension of my spine, but we can go from that all fours position, working on slow, controlled movement of the hip. From there, once I've done that, now I'm going to stand up, and I'm going to transition that quadruped strength, so that strength on all fours, to standing. So I can do a very similar thing, and we've done this in videos before on the golf course, actually as part of kind of a pre-round warm-up, where I can again work on that flexion of the hip, external rotation of the hip, internal rotation of the hip, into extension and back to neutral. Now a lot of you, when you first try this, you're going to find that you have these muscles on the side of your hip that might even go into spasm. You've had some people get up, rotate out, start to turn in and say, oh wait, I got to stop, I'm getting a cramp. Again, it just shows the inefficiency of some of these muscles that we just never really use. If I'm doing traditional deadlift, squat, lunge, I might not be activating some of these smaller muscles around the hip. So again, we're going to think flexion, external rotation, internal rotation into extension and down. I can start with my leg bent, and then eventually I can use kind of an obstacle with my legs straight. I can now try to create as much active flexion, external rotation, internal rotation, and extension as I can. Again, the slower the better. I want slow, controlled movement, working on all of the small muscles around our hip to create a better, healthier hip. Plus, it's going to help create tremendous balance, which is ultimately only going to help us